One bullet killed 20 million people. One rubber seal ended 7 lives and exposed a broken institution. 2 men drew lines across a map they had never seen and created conflicts that are still killing people a century later. History did not change slowly. It changed in single moments, bad decisions, and mornings that started like any other. These 36 incidents broke the world forever. Nobody put them in your aura moments textbook. But every single one of them is still affecting your life today. Pay attention. 1 On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 men boarded 4 commercial flights across the eastern United States. They carried box cutters. They had no army, no navy, no air force. What they had was a plan rehearsed for years, and a world that had never seriously imagined this kind of attack coming from inside its own airports. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers. 1 hit the Pentagon. The 4th crashed into a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back. In under 2 hours, nearly 3,000 people were dead, but the physical destruction was almost secondary to what followed. The United States launched 2 wars within months. Afghanistan first, then Iraq. Trillions of dollars spent. Hundreds of thousands dead across 2 decades. Airport security transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. Mass surveillance programs, built quietly in the background. Civil liberties debated and dismantled in the name of safety. The entire global order reshuffled around one morning. 19 men with box cutters did not just attack buildings, they handed governments everywhere a permanent excuse to watch, restrict, and control. The world that existed on September 10th never came back. Nobody voted for what replaced it. 2 In 1916, 2 men sat down with a map of the Middle East and drew lines across it. Mark. Sykes was British. François-Georges Picot was French. Neither had ever lived in the region. Neither spoke to a single Arab leader before deciding who would control what. They simply carved the Ottoman Empire into future spheres of influence with a pencil, splitting ancient communities, tribal lands, and religious territories into neat colonial boxes. Britain took what became Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. The people who actually lived there found out later. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, those pencil lines became real borders enforced by foreign armies. Communities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly on opposite sides of walls. Groups that shared nothing were crammed into the same artificial nations. The tensions this created did not fade with time. They compounded. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. The conflicts tearing these places apart today trace directly back to 2 bureaucrats with a map and an afternoon. Sykes died young. Picot lived to see what they built. Nobody ever asked the people whose world they divided. 3 On June 28, 1914. A 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stepped off a curb in Sarajevo and fired 2 shots. The targets were Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife, Sophie. Both died within the hour. Princip was a Bosnian Serb nationalist with tuberculosis, bad aim on his first attempt, and extraordinary luck on his second. He had actually given up earlier that morning, after a failed grenade attack by his group scattered everyone. He stopped at a deli. The Archduke's car made a wrong turn and stalled directly in front of him. He fired. What followed from those 2 bullets was catastrophic beyond any calculation. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany backed Austria. Russia backed Serbia. France backed Russia. Britain backed France. In 6 weeks, a regional assassination had ignited a continental war. 4 years later, the death toll stood near 20 million. Empires collapsed. Maps were redrawn. The conditions created by this war directly produced the next one. Princip did not plan to change the world. He planned to make a political statement. He died in prison in 1918, never fully understanding what his 2 bullets had started. 4 In April 1994. The president of Rwanda's plane was shot down over Kigali. Within hours, a killing machine that had been quietly organized for months activated across the country. Hutu extremists had lists. They had roadblocks. They had machetes stockpiled in warehouses. They had radio stations already broadcasting instructions. The Tutsi minority did not have much of anything. What followed was one of the fastest mass killings in record history. Approximately 800,000 people were murdered in roughly 100 days. That is around 8,000 people killed every single day. The United Nations had peacekeepers on the ground. They were ordered not to intervene. The Clinton administration internally avoided using the word genocide because using it would have legally required action. Western nations debated terminology while people were being hacked to death with farm tools. The killing stopped only when a Tutsi rebel army fought its way across the country and seized the capital. The genocidaires fled. The world issued statements of regret. No meaningful intervention ever came. Rwanda survived and rebuilt largely on its own. The lesson the world took from it remains unclear, because the same pattern repeated elsewhere within a decade. 5. On January 28, 1986, 73 seconds after launch, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart over the Atlantic Ocean. 7 astronauts died. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire, who was supposed to be the first civilian in space. Millions of children across America watched it happen live from their classrooms. The cause was a rubber O-ring seal on one of the solid rocket boosters. It failed because it was too cold that morning. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned NASA the night before. They had data showing the seals performed badly in low temperatures. They recommended delaying the launch. NASA managers pushed back. They asked the engineers to prove it was unsafe rather than prove it was safe. Under pressure, the engineers reversed their recommendation. The launch proceeded at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The O-ring failed almost immediately, leaking hot gas that eventually caused the breakup. A rubber seal the size of a bracelet, a management culture that punished caution. 7 people who trusted the Yi. The Rogers Commission investigation that followed found not just a mechanical failure, but an institutional one. NASA had known about O-ring problems for years and kept launching anyway. Challenger did not fall from the sky. It was sent there. 6. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers entered the South Vietnamese village of My Lai on a search and destroy mission. They found no enemy combatants. They found farmers, women, children, and elderly villagers. They killed them anyway. Estimates put the death toll between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians. Women were raped before being shot. Children were killed in ditches. A soldier named Hugh Thompson, an Army helicopter pilot, landed his aircraft between the troops and fleeing villagers and threatened to open fire on his own side if they did not stop. He was one of the few people present who acted like a human being. The Army covered it up for over a year. It only became public because a soldier named Ron Ridenour sent letters to Congress after hearing accounts from men who had been there. The subsequent investigation led to charges against 26 officers and soldiers. Exactly 1 was convicted. Lieutenant William Calley served 3.5 years of house arrest before being pardoned. No one else spent a single day in prison. My Lai did not end careers. It demonstrated something far more uncomfortable: that the system, protecting soldiers who commit atrocities, works exactly as designed. 7. In November 1978, 918 Americans died in the jungles of Guyana. Most of them drank poison, voluntarily. Some did not get the choice. People's Temple was founded by Jim Jones, an Indiana preacher who built a following promising racial equality, community, and salvation. By the 1970s, he had thousands of devoted members across California. He also had a growing paranoia, a serious drug habit, and a God complex that was deteriorating into core, something far darker. After investigative journalists began asking questions, Jones moved his entire community to a compound he built in the South American jungle and called Jonestown. Congressman Leo Ryan flew down to investigate after receiving letters from worried families. Jones had him shot on the airstrip. Then he called his congregation together and told them the end had come. He called it revolutionary suicide. Vats of clavum-laced punch were prepared. Adults drank. Children were given it by their parents. Those who hesitated were injected by force. Jones himself died of a gunshot wound to the head. 918 people died because one man convinced them that dying together was more dignified than living under a system that wanted to destroy them. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered the language as a joke. The bodies in that jungle were not a punchline. 8. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people starved to death in Soviet Ukraine. The Soviet government knew. They had engineered it. Stalin's collectivization program had stripped Ukrainian farmers of their grain, their livestock, and eventually their ability to feed themselves. When Ukrainians resisted collectivization, Moscow responded by increasing quotas. blacklisting entire villages, and sealing borders so people could not leave to find food. Activists were sent to search homes and confiscate every scrap of food they found, including seed grain. People ate grass, bark, and leather. Parents buried children. Neighbors disappeared. The death toll is estimated between 3.5 and 7.5 million people, though Soviet records were deliberately falsified to conceal the scale. The word Holodomor means death by hunger in Ukrainian. The Soviet Union denied it happened for decades. Western journalists who visited Ukraine at the time were shown model farms and wrote glowing reports. Walter Duranty of the New York Times actively dismissed starvation reports and won a Pulitzer Prize. The famine was not discovered by accident. It was covered up by design, by the government that caused it, and by foreign observers who found the Soviet experiment too ideologically convenient to question. In February 1993, federal agents surrounded a compound outside Waco, Texas, belonging to a religious group called the Branch Davidians. Their leader was David Koresh, a charismatic and deeply troubled man who believed he was a prophet and had been stockpiling weapons. An initial ATF raid went catastrophically wrong. 4 agents and 6 Davidians died in the gunfight. What followed was a 51-day standoff that the entire country watched on television. The FBI took over. Negotiations dragged. Tactics shifted between conciliation and psychological pressure. Loudspeakers blasting music and recordings through the night. Utilities cut, armored vehicles circling the property. On April 19th, the FBI moved in with tanks and tear gas. A fire started inside the compound. Within hours, 76 people were dead, including 25 children. Whether the Davidians started the fire themselves or whether government actions caused it has never been definitively settled. What was settled was the image. Millions of Americans watched the government roll tanks into an American building and drive out with 76 bodies. It radicalized a generation of anti-government movements. 2 years later to the day, Timothy McVeigh bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. He cited Waco as his reason. On March 24, 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez struck a reef in Prince William Sound off the coast of Alaska and began leaking crude oil into one of the most pristine marine environments on Earth. By the time it stopped, approximately 11 million gallons of oil had spilled across 1,300 miles of coastline. The captain was not on the bridge when it happened. He had left a third mate in charge and gone below. The third mate was operating on insufficient sleep. The ship's radar system that might have caught the drift had been broken for over a year and never repaired. Exxon's response was slow, disorganized, and widely criticized. Cleanup workers arrived without proper equipment. Oil soaked into beaches and settled under rocks where it remained for years. An estimated 250,000 seabirds died. Thousands of sea otters, seals, and killer whales perished. The fishing industry that communities had depended on for generations collapsed overnight. Exxon eventually paid around $900 million in settlements. Their original punitive damages of $5 billion were reduced by the Supreme Court to $507 million after 2 decades of legal battles. The fishermen who lost everything got checks that barely covered their losses. Exxon posted record profits the following year. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service launched a medical study in Macon County, Alabama. They recruited 399 black men with syphilis and told them they were being treated for bad blood, a local term covering several conditions. They were not being treated for anything. They were being watched. Doctors wanted to study what untreated syphilis did to the human body over time. The men were given placebos, ineffective treatments, and free meals in exchange for participation. When penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947, the men were not given it. The study continued for 40 years. It only ended in 1972, when a whistleblower named Peter Buxton leaked documents to the press. By then, 28 men had died directly from syphilis. 100 more had died from related complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The government had watched all of it happen and taken careful notes. The fallout permanently damaged trust between Black Americans and the medical establishment. Decades later, that distrust showed up in vaccine hesitancy, delayed diagnoses, and avoided doctor's appointments. The Tuskegee study did not end in 1972. Its consequences are still being measured today. In the early 19th century, Britain had a problem. The British public had developed an enormous appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China wanted almost nothing Britain produced in return. The trade deficit was bleeding British treasury dry. The solution the British East India Company arrived at was opium. They grew it in India and smuggled it into China in industrial quantities, deliberately creating mass addiction across Chinese society to balance the books. When China's emperor tried to stop it, seizing and destroying opium stockpiles and expelling foreign traders, Britain went to war. Twice. The First Opium War ended in 1842, with China forced to hand over Hong Kong and open its ports. The Second War ended in 1860, with even harsher terms, foreign troops occupying Beijing, and the Summer Palace burned to the ground. China was forced to legalize opium. The addiction crisis that followed gutted Chinese society for generations. The humiliation of these wars, referred to in China as the Century of Humiliation, became the defining national wound that shaped Chinese politics, foreign policy, and national identity for the next 150 years. Everything China does today in relation to Western powers is filtered through the memory of being forced at gunpoint to accept a drug shipment. 13 On June 28, 1919, representatives of the defeated German nation entered the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and signed a peace treaty ending World War I. The terms were designed not just to end a war, but to punish a country. Germany lost 13% of its territory. It lost all its overseas colonies. Its military was reduced to a token force. It was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war under a clause that became known as the War Guilt Clause. And it was handed a reparations bill eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure so enormous the final payment was not made until 2010. The German economy collapsed under the weight. Hyperinflation destroyed savings overnight. Unemployment gutted entire cities. A population that had been told they were winning the war in 1918 suddenly found themselves blamed for everything and stripped of everything. Into that humiliation walked a failed Austrian painter who had a talent for telling desperate people who to blame. The Tour Famine no Junge did not cause Adolf Hitler, but it built the room he walked into. The Tour Famine no Junge did not cause Adolf Hitler, but it built the room he walked into. The Tour Dunge diplomats at Versailles thought they were ending a war. They were writing the opening chapter of a worse one. 14 In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet Adolf Hitler. Hitler wanted the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German-speaking population. Chamberlain gave it to him without asking Czechoslovakia. He flew home waving a piece of paper and announced he had secured peace for our time. The crowd that greeted him was enormous and relieved. Nobody wanted another war. The logic seemed sound. Give Hitler this one thing and he would stop. The logic was catastrophically wrong. Hitler had already decided Czechoslovakia was just the beginning. 6 months after Munich, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. 6 months after that, they invaded Poland, and the war everyone had been trying to avoid began anyway. Except now, Germany was stronger, better positioned, and emboldened by the knowledge that Western democracies would negotiate rather than fight. Czechoslovakia, which had a functioning Ypres-fortified border defenses in 1938, never got the chance to use them. They were handed to Germany by countries that were supposed to be their friends. Munich became the permanent historical example of what happens when democracies try to negotiate with Ypres who have already decided that negotiation is a weakness to be exploited. 15 On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died from radiation in the weeks and months that followed. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after. The peace debate that began the moment the mushroom cloud appeared has never stopped. The American government argued the bombs prevented a land invasion of Japan that would cost millions of lives on both sides. Critics argued Japan was already seeking deep surrender terms, that the bombs were partly a demonstration for Soviet benefit, and that deliberately targeting civilian cities crossed a moral line that no military justification could cover. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had no part in that debate. They had no buttes, warning. Children were walking to school. Workers were opening shops. A city was beginning its morning. Then it was gone. Whatever the strategic calculation, The atomic beast bomb permanently changed what war meant. Every conflict since 1945 has been fought under the shadow of the question nobody wants to answer. What happens the next time someone decides the calculation is worth it again? 16 On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded during a safety test. The explosion was so powerful it blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off the building. Fires burned for days. Radioactive material shot into the atmosphere and drifted across Europe. The Soviet government's first instinct was not evacuation. It was denial. Local officials were told not to alarm the population. Pripyat, a city of 50,000 people directly next to the plant, was not evacuated until 36 hours after the explosion. The May Day parade in Kyiv, 80 miles away, proceeded as scheduled while radiation levels spiked. Soviet leaders did not publicly acknowledge a major accident had occurred for days, and even then minimized the scale. Swedish radiation monitors eventually forced the issue when they detected contamination on their own territory and demanded answers. The Chernobyl disaster did not just release radiation. It released the truth about how the Soviet system functioned, built on secrecy, maintained through fear, incapable of honest crisis response. Mikhail Gorbachev later said Chernobyl was perhaps the true cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. The reactor that exploded in Ukraine cracked something far larger than a building. 17 In 1830, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson. Its purpose was straightforward: remove the 5 civilized tribes from their ancestral lands in the American Southeast and push them west of the Mississippi into designated Indian Territory. The Cherokee Nation took the case to the Supreme Court and won. Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling. Between 1836 and 1839, approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were rounded up by federal troops, held in internment camps, and then marched roughly 1,200 miles westward through brutal winter conditions without adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Estimates of Cherokee deaths range from 4,000 to 8,000 people, roughly a quarter of the entire nation. They called the route Nanadal Suni, the trail where they cried. American school children call it the Trail of Tears. The removal was not the result of war, resistance, or conflict. The Cherokee had adopted written language, a constitution, and a legal system modeled on American democracy. They had done everything asked of them. They were removed anyway because the land they lived on had value and the people living on it did not. A Supreme Court ruling meant nothing when the president decided it meant nothing. 18 In December 1937, Japanese forces captured the Chinese city of Nanjing. What followed over the next 6 weeks became one of the most extensively documented atrocities of the 20th century and simultaneously one of the most politically contested. Estimates of the death toll range from 40,000 to over 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war killed. Women were systematically raped in numbers that historians estimate in the tens of thousands. The punt killings were not chaotic or accidental. Officers held competitions. Soldiers were studied, photographed. Diaries were kept. International observers documented what they witnessed. A small group of Western business people and missionaries created a safety zone in the city and sheltered roughly 200,000 people, directly confronting Japanese soldiers to prevent punt killings. Their records survive. Japan's relationship with this history has been one of the most damaging diplomatic wounds in Asian geopolitics ever since. Official Japanese textbooks have repeatedly minimized or omitted the massacre. Government ministers have denied the punt scale. China has used the memory as a permanent political instrument. 2 of Asia's largest economies have never fully settled what happened in Nanjing, and the unresolved wound shapes relations between them to this day. 19 On May 4, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University in Ohio. 4 students were killed. 9 were wounded. 1 was permanently paralyzed. The students had been protesting Nixon's decision to expand the Vietnam War into Cambodia, a decision announced just days earlier. The guardsmen had been on campus for several days managing protests that had included some property destruction. What the students killed on May 4th were doing at the moment of the shooting varied. Some were active protesters. Some were bystanders walking between classes. The distance between the guardsmen and the students when shots were fired ranged from 60 to 750 feet. No order to fire was ever clearly established. No guardsman was ever convicted of any crime. A photograph taken by a student named John Philo of a teenage girl kneeling over a dead body became one of the defining images of the era. Campuses across the country shut down in protest. Over 4 million students went on strike. The incident did not end the Vietnam War, but it fundamentally changed the relationship between American citizens and their government's willingness to use lethal force against its own people on its own soil in broad daylight. On April 20, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 workers and beginning the largest marine oil spill in history. Over the next 87 days, approximately 4.9 million barrels of oil poured into the Gulf before the well was capped. The explosion was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. Weeks before the blowout, workers had reported serious problems with the well's pressure readings. Critical safety tests had produced concerning results that were misinterpreted or ignored. BP and its contractors were behind schedule and under intense financial pressure to reach oil. Shortcuts had been taken on cementing the well casing. The blowout preventer, the last line of defense against exactly this kind of catastrophe, failed. 1,300 miles of coastline were affected. Fishing pounded from Diequid. Industries across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of barrels of chemical dispersant were sprayed into the water, whose long-term effects remain disputed. BP eventually paid over $65 billion in cleanup costs and settlements. The 11 men who died on the rig the night it exploded received none of it. Their families received settlements whose terms were sealed. The Gulf recovered slowly. Some of it never did. In 1915, the Ottoman government began a systematic campaign to eliminate its Armenian population. What followed was a coordinated operation involving mass deportations, death marches into the Syrian desert, mass shootings, and deliberate starvation. Estimates of Armenian deaths range from 600,000 to 1.5 million people. The methods were organized. Deportation orders came from central government. Local officials who refused to carry them out were replaced with ones who would. The killing was not spontaneous mob violence. It was policy. What happened afterward was almost as significant as what happened during. The Ottoman government denied it. The successor Turkish state denied it. Decades of diplomatic pressure, economic relationships, and NATO alliance politics meant that Western governments avoided formally recognizing what had happened. The United States did not officially recognize the Armenian genocide until 2021. Adolf Hitler, preparing his own genocide, reportedly asked his generals, who today remembers the extermination of the Armenians. He understood that the world had looked away once and survived politically. The Armenian genocide became the template, not just for how to kill an ethnic group, but for how a government could do it and then simply refuse to admit it ever happened, while the rest of the world found reasons to agree. In 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution in China. He called it a campaign to purge capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society and renew revolutionary spirit. What it actually was a decade-long catastrophe that dismantled Chinese civilization from the inside. Mao mobilized millions of young people organized into groups called Red Guards and unleashed them on teachers, intellectuals, artists, doctors, and anyone deemed insufficiently revolutionary. Schools and universities closed, books were burned, temples were destroyed. Ancient artifacts were smashed as relics of the feudal past. People were publicly humiliated, beaten, and killed by teenage mobs acting in Mao's name. Professionals who had spent decades building expertise were sent to labor camps or rural villages for reeducation. An entire generation of Chinese intellectuals was either killed, imprisoned, or broken. Estimates of deaths caused directly or indirectly by the Cultural Revolution range from 500,000 to 2 million people. The deeper damage was harder to count. China lost a generation of doctors, engineers, scientists, and educators. Institutions that take centuries to build were destroyed in months. When the Cultural Revolution ended with Mao's death in 1976, China had to rebuild not just its economy, but its entire capacity to think. In April 1975, a communist guerrilla movement called the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom and took control of Cambodia. Their leader was a man named Pol Pot, who had studied in Paris and returned with an ideology so extreme it is almost impossible to fully comprehend. He declared Year Zero, History was to be erased and society rebuilt from nothing. Cities were emptied at gunpoint within days. 2 million people were forced into the countryside to work as agricultural laborers. Money was abolished, schools were closed, hospitals emptied. Wearing glasses was enough to mark someone as an intellectual and therefore an enemy. The Khmer Rouge killed doctors, teachers, monks, and anyone who parlait le monde. They killed people for being educated. They killed people for being from cities. They killed people whose hands were too soft to have done manual labor. Between 1975 and 1979, approximately 1.7 to 2.5 million people died, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population, through execution, starvation, disease, and forced labor. The regime was toppled by a Vietnamese invasion in 1979. Pol Pot lived until 1998, dying under house arrest, never tried for any crime by any international court. He gave an interview in 1997 and said his conscience was clear. 24 between 1959 and 1961. Somewhere between 15 and 55 million people starved to death in China. The range is that wide because the Chinese government spent decades hiding them reins. Evidence. The cause was the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong's campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into a socialist industrial powerhouse. Farmers Lippelschenwung were pulled off fields and put to work melting down metal in backyard furnaces to meet steel middle production quotas. The steel produced was mostly useless. The fields went untended. At the Regendoppingfront, same time, local officials terrified of reporting failure to Beijing falsified grain production, numbers wildly upward. Based on these fictional harvests, the government exported grain Peopleschen abroad to maintain the appearance of success while its own population starved. When peeping in Pejmonesli Sikhus while its own population starved, people reported the famine. They were accused of being right-wing elements sabotaging the reigns, revolution. Aid was denied to areas designated as underperforming. Villagers who tried to reigns, flee were turned back. People ate bark, mud, and in documented cases each other. Famine ended not because of policy change, but because Mao eventually scaled back the reigns program. He was never removed from power. He launched the Cultural Revolution 5 years later. The death toll of the Great Leap Forward remained officially suppressed in China for decades. 25 In August 1947, British India was divided into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. The man who drew the border was a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before and was given 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent of 400 million people along religious lines. He worked from outdated maps. He had no reliable census data. He made decisions about communities he had never seen. When the borders were announced, approximately 14 million people found themselves on the wrong side of a line, drawn by a stranger in an office in Delhi. What followed was one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan. Muslims fled India. Trains carrying refugees were stopped and massacred by mobs from the other religion. Villages were burned. Women were killed by their own families to prevent capture. Estimates of deaths range from 200,000 to 2 million people in a matter of weeks. Radcliffe burned his papers after finishing the border and left India immediately. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars since 1947. They both have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. The border Radcliffe drew in 5 weeks has shaped South Asian geopolitics for nearly 80 years. 26 In 1953, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup organized and funded by the CIA and British intelligence. His crime was nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, paying Iranians almost nothing for oil extracted from their own ground. Mossadegh wanted Iranians to benefit from Iranian oil. Britain and America wanted the oil. The coup took days. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah was reinstalled and ruled as an American-backed autocrat for 26 years. His secret police, Savak, tortured and killed political opponents with American knowledge and equipment. The resentment this built did not evaporate. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution swept away the Shah and installed an Islamic theocracy that has defined American-Iranian relations ever since. Iranians did not hate America randomly. They hated Iranians machinely. Iranians machin coup pas de vidéistes. The hostage crisis, the sanctions, the proxy conflicts, the nuclear standoff, all of it runs directly back to 1953, when two governments decided that Iranian democracy was less important than Iranian oil. 27 in 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal control of the Congo Free State by European powers at the Berlin Conference. He presented himself as a humanitarian, bringing civilization and Christianity to Central Africa. What he actually built was one of history's most brutal extraction operations, run not by a government, but by a private business enterprise, with its own army. The Congo's population was put to work harvesting rubber. Quotas were set. To enforce them, Leopold's Force Publique adopted a system of cutting off the hands of workers who failed to meet their targets. Hands became the currency of accountability. Soldiers were required to produce severed hands as proof they had punished underperformers. Villages that resisted were burned, hostages were taken, entire communities were worked to death. Population estimates for the Congo before and after. Leopold's rule suggest between 1 and 10 million people died. The regime was eventually exposed by journalists and human rights campaigners, including an Irishman named Roger Casement, whose reports shocked European audiences. Belgium eventually took control of the colony from Leopold in 1908. Leopold died wealthy and celebrated in Belgium. The Congo has never fully recovered from what was done to it, and the structural poverty and instability that defines it today traces directly to those decades of systematic destruction. 28 through the 1930s. A series of devastating dust storms tore across the Great Plains of the United States, turning millions of acres of farmland into desert and driving hundreds of thousands of families from their homes. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made one wearing the costume of weather. For decades, settlers had plowed under the native grasses that held the plains soil together, replacing them with wheat fields that looked to be profitable in wet years but left the earth completely exposed when drought arrived. When the rains stopped in the early 1930s and the winds came, there was nothing to hold the land. Storms so large they blotted out the sun rolled across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado. Black blizzards buried farm equipment, suffocated livestock, and killed children with dust pneumonia. Families packed everything they owned into cars and drove west toward California, where they were met with hostility, labor exploitation, and makeshift camps. Approximately 3.5 million people were displaced. Many never returned. The land they abandoned took decades to recover, and only because the federal government intervened with soil conservation programs that told farmers to stop doing exactly what they had been doing. The Dust Bowl was not bad luck. It was the predictable result of ignoring how land actually works. 29 on October 24, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed. In a single day, investors lost billions of dollars as panic selling fed more panic selling in a cascade that no individual decision could stop. The crash had been building for years. Throughout the 1920s, stock prices had been inflated by speculation, easy credit, and a widespread belief that markets only moved upward. Ordinary people had borrowed money to buy stocks. Banks had loaned money recklessly. Regulatory oversight was minimal. When confidence cracked, it cracked completely. By 1932, American industrial production had fallen by half. Unemployment reached 25%. Thousands of banks failed, wiping out the savings of ordinary people who had done nothing wrong. The Depression spread rapidly across a globally connected economy, hitting Europe especially hard. In Germany, the economic collapse destroyed the Weimar Republic's credibility and created the desperation that made radical political solutions appealing to millions of people. The Great Depression did not cause World War II directly, but it created the economic conditions, the mass unemployment, the institutional collapse, the political radicalization that made fascism a viable mass movement across an entire continent. The stock market crash of 1929 did not just break an economy. It broke the political stability of the Western world for the following decade. 30. On August 10, 1964, the USS Maddox, an American destroyer operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, a second attack was reported. President Lyndon Johnson used both incidents to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress, giving him broad authority to escalate American military involvement in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The first incident was real, though the circumstances were disputed. The second attack almost certainly never happened. The crew of the Maddox themselves expressed doubt almost immediately. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later admitted the evidence for the second attack was thin at best. Declassified documents have since confirmed serious spy news. Doubts existed within the administration at the time. The resolution passed anyway. Congress voted 416-0 in the House and 88-2 in the Senate to authorize a war based on an attack that in all likelihood did not occur. Over the following decade, 58,220 Americans died in Vietnam. An estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese died. The war ended with American withdrawal and North Vietnamese victory, achieving nothing that could not have been achieved without the war. It started because a president needed a justification and found one in the dark waters of a gulf where nothing may have happened at all. 31 On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in New York City. Within 18 minutes, 146 garment workers were dead. Most of them were young immigrant women, some as young as 14. The building itself did not collapse. The workers died because the exits were locked. Factory owners routinely locked stairwell doors during shift to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. The single fire escape collapsed under the weight of fleeing workers. Elevators stopped functioning. Women on the upper floors faced a choice between burning alive and jumping. Crowds on the street below watched them fall. The owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, had survived a previous factory fire by accessing a rooftop door their workers did not know existed. They were tried for manslaughter and acquitted. They collected their insurance money and reopened in a new location where they were subsequently caught again locking the exit doors and fined $20. The deaths at Triangle did not go unanswered. The tragedy galvanized the American labor movement in ways that years of strikes had failed to do. Fire codes were rewritten. Labor laws were strengthened. The political coalition it energized pushed through reforms that formed the foundation of the modern American workplace. 146 people died to establish the basic principle that workers deserve to leave a building alive. 32 in the late 1950s and early 1960s. A drug called thalidomide was prescribed across Europe, Canada, and Australia to treat morning sickness in pregnant women. It worked well for wind nausea. It also caused catastrophic birth defects. Babies were born with severely shortened or absent limbs, malformed ears, damaged internal organs, and other devastating Thalidomide abnormalities. Approximately 10,000 children were affected worldwide. The actual number is bullshit, likely higher because many pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth without the top connection being made. The drug had been approved and distributed with almost no testing on pregnant animals. The company that made it, Grunenthal, had conducted minimal safety trials and aggressively marketed the drug across multiple countries simultaneously. In the United States, a Food and Drug Administration reviewer named Frances Kelsey repeatedly refused to approve thalidomide despite intense commercial pressure, citing insufficient safety data. Her obstruction was later recognized as one of the most consequential regulatory decisions in American history. Europe was not so fortunate. Thalidomide survivors, called thalidomiders, grew up in a world with almost no support systems or legal recognition. Grunenthal did not issue a formal apology until 2012, more than 50 years after the damage was done. The thalidomide scandal rewrote pharmaceutical testing standards globally and is the direct reason drugs are now tested on pregnant animals before human consumption. 33 The Aral Sea was once the fourth largest lake in the world. It sat between Kazakhstan and Sykes-Picot. In Central Asia, fed by two rivers, home to a thriving fishing industry, and Sykes-Picot, rounded by communities that had depended on it for centuries. In the 1960s, Soviet planners decided to use those two rivers to irrigate cotton fields across the desert. They built canals. They diverted the water. They did not seriously consider what would happen to the Sykes-Picot lake when its source dried up. What happened was that the lake began to disappear. Slowly, at first, then faster. By the 1980s, it had shrunk dramatically. By the 2000s, it had split into Sykes-Picot's smaller remnants. Today, the southern portion is essentially gone, replaced by a desert locals called the Aral Sea, littered with the rusting hulks of fishing boats stranded miles from any water. The fish industry that supported entire cities collapsed completely. Unemployment devastated the surrounding communities. The exposed lakebed became a source of toxic dust storms, carrying salt, pesticides, and chemicals that had settled on the bottom over decades, spreading across the region and causing severe health problems, including throat cancers and respiratory disease. The Soviet Union achieved its cotton production targets. The fishing communities that lost everything were never compensated or acknowledged. The Aral Sea disaster remains the most visually dramatic ecological catastrophe of the 20th century because the evidence is still sitting there rusting in the sand. 34 in 1956. A chemical company called Chiso Corporation was releasing mercury-contaminated wastewater into Minamata Bay in Japan. They had been doing it for years. The mercury settled into the bay's ecosystem, was absorbed by fish and shellfish, and worked its way up the food chain in increasingly concentrated doses. The fishing communities around Minamata Bay ate fish from that water every day. Cats in the village began convulsing and throwing themselves into the sea. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. Then people started getting sick. Symptoms began with numbness in the hands and feet, then narrowing vision, then loss of muscle control, then inability to walk or speak. Children were born with severe neurological damage to mothers who showed no symptoms themselves. The disease was named Minamata disease. Chiso knew their wastewater was the cause almost immediately. They concealed it. They changed their discharge point to a different river, spreading the contamination further. They funded their own internal research and suppressed findings that implicated them. The Japanese government, in the middle of an aggressive industrial expansion, was slow to act and slower to hold the company accountable. Victims sued Chiso and eventually won, but legal battles stretched for decades. Some victims were still fighting for recognition and compensation into the 2000s. Minamata was not an accident that got out of hand. It was a decision to keep poisoning people because stopping was expensive. 35 on August 13, 1961. East German workers began building a wall through the middle of Berlin. By morning, barbed wire divided the city. Within days, it was concrete. Families who had gone to sleep in the same city woke up in different countries. People were cut off from their jobs, their relatives, their lives, with no warning and no preparation. The Berlin Wall was built not to keep enemies out, but to keep citizens in. East Germany was hemorrhaging its population. Skilled workers, doctors, engineers, and young people were crossing into West Berlin at a rate that threatened to collapse the East German state entirely. The wall stopped the bleeding by turning an entire nation into a prison. Over the following 28 years, at least 140 people were killed attempting to cross it, though some estimates run considerably higher. People tried everything: tunnels, hot air balloons, hidden compartments in cars, swimming canals, ramming vehicles through checkpoints. Some made it, many did not. The wall became the defining symbol of the Cold War's human cost, the physical proof that one side of the ideological divide needed to cage its own citizens to survive. When it finally fell on November 9, 1989, people tore it apart with hammers and their bare hands. 28 years of concrete came down in a night. The pieces sold as souvenirs. Some things are worth more as rubble. 36 on June 28, 1914. A 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stepped off a curb in Sarajevo and fired 2 shots into an open car. The targets were Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Bally Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie. Both were dead within the hour. Princip had tuberculosis, a failed assassination attempt behind him that same morning, and no real expectation of success when he stopped at a deli and found history pulling the Archduke's Bally car directly in front of him. He fired almost by instinct. What those 2 bullets set in motion was beyond any calculation any person on earth could have made that morning. Austria blamed Serbia. Germany backed Austria unconditionally. Russia mobilized for Serbia. France was treaty-bound to Russia. Britain entered when Germany violated Belgian Purchkum. In 6 weeks, a continent was at war. In 4 years, nearly 20 million people were dead. 4 empires collapsed. The map of Europe was redrawn by exhausted men in bare conference rooms who planted the seeds of the next war inside the peace treaty ending this bare one. That second war killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. The Mumpiat nuclear weapons developed during it reshaped every conflict that followed. The Cold War, the Middle East, the borders of modern Europe and Asia, All of it runs in a direct line back to a wrong turn, a stalled car, and a 19-year-old with a pistol who had already given up for the day. One bullet, 1 century of consequences. History does not announce itself. It just happens, and then everything is different. Most people will scroll past this. The ones who stay are the ones who actually want to understand how the world got this broken. Subscribe. Share this with someone who still thinks history is boring. And drop in the comments which one hit you the hardest.